In this video, you're going to learn 3 worship leading skills that you should not leave behind when this lockdown lifts and churches meet in person again. Coming up. Hey, Spencer here from leadingworshipwell.com, your daily dose of practical worship leading tips. If you want to find those tips, head over to Instagram or Facebook at Leading Worship Well, where I'm posting new worship leading tips every single day. But you're here on YouTube, so go ahead, hit subscribe down below, and let's get into it, because today, I've been talking about this for a while on the YouTube channel, the past couple weeks at least. I've been talking about the fact that churches are starting to meet in person again. And as the lockdown lifts, there's some things that we need to be aware of as worship leaders. And I kind of mentioned this in last week's video, which you can check out right here. This was one of the things that you needed to consider. But as we move out of this lockdown and back into in-person gatherings, I want you to consider some skills that you've built over this past period of leading online and not being able to gather in person, because there have been some good things that have come out of these past 2.5 months of us not meeting in person as a church. Obviously, we wish that we could meet in person as a church, but that hasn't been able to happen, and I think it's forced us as worship leaders to develop some new skills. And some of those skills we just needed to develop for that season of not meeting in person. But there's some other skills, which is what I'm going to talk about today, that we need to carry forward and really continue to hone as we learn how to lead in person again in whatever the new way that looks like is. But there's some skills that we need to take from the lockdown and continue working on. So before we get into today's video and talk about that, I just want to hear from you. I want to hear what's one skill that you feel like you've learned during this period of social distancing and not meeting with your church in person. What's one worship leading skill that you feel like you've been able to develop? Maybe it's like a technology thing and you learned how to live stream. Maybe you just learned how to talk to your church better or keep in touch with them, or whatever it is. Let me know in the comments down below. Scroll down there, leave a thumbs up on the way down there, and let me know the answer to that question. What's one worship leading skill you've learned during this lockdown period? I'll talk to you in a second. Thanks so much for leaving your answer below. Let's get into the 3 worship leading skills that you should not leave behind when the lockdown lifts. The first skill that you need to continue working on that you've developed during this lockdown period is your communication. There's no doubt that leading online has been difficult, and I think one of the things that worship leaders have really had to focus on if they wanted to lead well, some people just ignored it and they just went about business as usual, but I know the Leading Worship Well community, and I know that you guys were really trying to figure out how to lead worship well online as well, and one of those things is communication. You had to learn how to communicate better with your church, because whenever you're in a room, there's sort of a lot of grace in that you could just walk up on stage and start playing a song. I'm not saying that's the best way to do it, but it was probably acceptable for at the beginning of your service if you just showed up or walked up on stage at the beginning of your service and kicked things off with a song and never talked to your church. But whenever you were online, I hope you talked to your church a little bit, and you probably had to communicate more, because whenever you're online, you don't get like these body language prompts that you'd get in person. It's kind of like whenever you're on a Zoom call now and it's sort of awkward, like it's a conversation, but it's not a real conversation, or not a normal conversation. There's external factors that come into play. The same thing happened whenever you were leading worship online, and there were just certain social cues that we're used to having whenever we meet in person, and really it all revolves around communicating. So we had to learn how to be better communicators as worship leaders during this season, and I think one of the ways that happened was we learned that we have to communicate more. So maybe you never talked whenever you were leading worship in person before, and you just said, it's sufficient for me to just play through the songs and people know what they're going to do. But as we've moved online, we've had to explain this new process of what it looks like to worship online to our church. And so maybe you found yourself explaining more. And I think that is a beneficial skill, not just whenever we're leading online, which, by the way, you're still kind of leading online, because there's going to be people in your church who don't feel comfortable returning to in-person worship yet. So we need to keep communicating well for them as well. You can check more out about that in this video here, where I talk about how to lead in-person and online churchgoers at the same time. But I digress. We need to communicate better just in general, whether we're in person or online, and that means communicating more. Communicating more doesn't mean talking more. Doesn't mean that instead of you saying one thing, now you talk for 10 minutes between every song. It just means that you communicate better. Like, you think through, what are the things in my worship service and my worship set that people might be confused about. And I think there's more confusion on a Sunday morning than you expect. Like, we just kind of assume that people know things because we set up the service and we know why everything goes in the order that it goes in, and we know why we're doing what we're doing. But the average person who comes to your church, they don't know that. So communicate those things with them and think about, like, what do I need to teach my church about? Like, where have I been falling short before this lockdown? And now that I've started to build this skill of communication, what are some of the things that I need to communicate now that I have started to build that skill? So think through those things and continue that skill of, I want to say over communicating, but I think, like, there's over communicating where you talk way too much, but then for a lot of people, over communicating is just a good way to communicate because they don't communicate enough. So if you're self-aware and you're like, I don't communicate enough, think about yourself as an over communicator, as somebody who needs to just say more than you've probably been saying, and think through those things that you need to explain. Think through how you can teach your church in this season what worship looks like, and work those into your speaking transitions on a Sunday morning. Continue the skill of communication even now that the lockdown has lifted. The second worship leading skill that you need to not abandon now that the lockdown has lifted is not something that you do on Sunday mornings, but it's so important. Oftentimes we just think about Sunday mornings, but this skill is to connect with your church outside of Sunday mornings. This is something that I've been pushing for a while since the lockdown started, and that is, people keep asking me, like, I don't feel connected to my church whenever I lead online. And if that's the way you feel, then I just want to say that you're probably not connected as much as you think to your church whenever you're leading in person as well. Because connection doesn't just happen on Sunday mornings. Like, we need to be connecting if we're actually going to be connecting and not just connecting with quotes around it with the people that we're leading. That doesn't just happen one time a week. Like, we need to be interacting with them throughout the week. So if you've started to build that skill of actually connecting with your church and not just like, well, I made eye contact with somebody on a Sunday morning and I felt a connection there, not in a romantic way, but just like we were in this together. Like, you can cultivate those moments outside of a Sunday morning, not just whenever you're leading worship or if you just casually say hi to somebody in the lobby before your service starts. So continue that skill of connecting with people outside of your Sunday morning. I know that we've had to put in more work as leaders in the church to maintain connections during this season because we weren't physically seeing people anymore. And so I just want to encourage you to continue that. Like, continue to check in with people throughout the week. You don't have to just do that whenever you don't see them, like on a Sunday morning. Like, just do that. Like, that's what it means to be part of the church, and that's what it means to build connections with people. So figure out how you can connect with people outside of a Sunday morning. And sure, that might be like sending a text or sending a Facebook message, or this is something I've been thinking about, is like you just posting more on social media, because there's a connection that's built. Like, I know that there are people who follow me on Leading Worship Well on Instagram, and I post Instagram stories, and they feel connected to me, even though I'm not like seeing them, but I am allowing them to see into my life. And if we do that as church leaders, then people will feel more connected to us because we're like real people. So think about what it means to just post more on social media. I feel like that's a valuable thing. Like, I know for a while as a leader in the church, I was afraid to post on social media because it's just too much work to kind of think through like what belongs on there and what shouldn't belong on there. Not that I'm like doing anything crazy that I don't think that my church would appreciate, but you just overthink things whenever you're in leadership. I know how it is. But I just want to encourage you to post more if you're looking to connect with people. Like, that's a really simple, general way that you can connect with a lot of people, and it's an option that we haven't had before in the past. That's just something I've been thinking about. I wasn't really planning on talking about that in this video, but there it was, it came out. So also send messages to people. Eventually we're going to be able to go out with people during the middle of the week and have coffee with them and talk to them. So really raise up relationships in this season of returning back to church, because that's what people have been missing. That's what people want. So just be cognizant of that and figure out how can you connect with your church outside of just a Sunday morning. Finally, the third thing that we should not leave behind whenever the lockdown lifts is highlighting unity in the church. This is another idea that I've been pushing really hard since the lockdown started, and that is the fact that everybody was in their own separate spaces, right? So everybody was at their home. We didn't see other people from the church. Maybe send them messages, whatever. But whenever you were there, like attending a service on a Sunday morning, it just felt isolating, like you were just there by yourself. So it was our responsibility as worship leaders to raise up this idea of unity, that hey, in this moment right now, like you might feel alone, you might be in the room sitting by yourself, but we're all worshiping together. Like, I'm here worshiping with you, you're worshiping with the other people in our church. And that's a good message whenever we aren't meeting in person. But I think it's also a message or a skill that we need to learn how to highlight unity. It's a good message to keep conveying as we gather as a church, because I think that it's a message that we kind of neglected in this past season before the lockdown happened and we weren't able to meet in person anymore. Like, my observation in people's understanding of worship on a Sunday morning is that we've kind of perpetuated this idea that we are gathering together, but we're all just gathering together in a room to have our own personal worship experiences. And that's not what corporate worship is. Like, if you want to have your own personal worship experience, you can do that anytime throughout the week. You don't need me to do that. You don't need me to play a song. Like, no, we have a responsibility to each other in the midst of our worship services, and that is unity. Like, we are in this together. We aren't just in the same room together, but we are literally in this together. So we are praying for people during worship. We're singing these songs not just for ourselves, but for the people around us, because we want to sing the words over them as prayers, but we also want to remind them of the truth in the songs, and we want to celebrate what God is doing in our lives, but also in the lives of the entire church and everybody who's part of the church. So think about how you can raise up some of those ideas and communicate them, like I talked about in point number 1. Communicate that idea of unity that's going to be so important. It was really important. We've just kind of neglected it in the previous season. It was really important in this season where we weren't able to meet together in person. It's going to be important still as we meet together again. So unity, unity, unity. If you can build up unity in your church, that's like what Christ prayed for, right? Like, we should be one. And so we need to raise that up in worship as well. Highlight unity in your church. So those were 3 worship leading skills that you shouldn't leave behind. I'm sure there's more. If you think of any more, leave them in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what skill you've built during this season that you'd like to carry forward as the lockdown ends. But speaking of skills, if you're looking for a way to develop your worship leading, I put together a free audio training. It's called 5 Tips to Instantly Improve Your Worship Leading. In the audio training, it's like 20 minutes long, maybe. It's pretty short. I share with you 5 things that you need to just be aware of. Like, they aren't difficult to do. You just need to know about them and make the effort to do them, and then they will instantly improve your worship leading. So make sure to get that if you haven't gotten that before. I'll link it in the description below. But other than that, thanks so much for joining me today. Once again, my name's Spencer Cormany from leadingworshipwell.com, and until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.